we always came back victorious. That wasn't the issue. But there were some that were more upsetting than others. There was a couple times where I kind of broke down a little bit. Looking back on it, I think it was understandable, but we had the firefight for 20, 25 minutes. And then when it was over, my boat captain said, "Okay, Sater, go out and bring in the minesweep gear." And at that point, I was just fried, and I just screamed at God. I looked up through the gun mount and I told God, "If you're going to kill me, just kill me." I just kept screaming at him, and then I climbed out.
Terry Sater stood in a Vietnamese rice paddy with bullets snapping past his head and made a deal with God that would define the rest of his life. And I mean, when you hear what this guy went through, you'll understand why that prayer wasn't desperation, it was just honesty. Sater was a young infantryman serving with the 25th Infantry Division in Vietnam, and his story is one of those accounts that doesn't get told nearly enough. You know, the kind of raw, unfiltered experience that reminds you what these guys actually faced over there. We're talking about a soldier who saw combat at its most brutal, who watched friends die, who got wounded himself, and who came out the other side carrying memories that most of us can't even begin to imagine. And look, before we get too deep into Terry Sater's story, I just want to mention that I put out these veteran accounts pretty regularly because I think it matters. I really do. These men and women lived through things that shaped our country, and their voices deserve to be heard. So, if you're the type of person who cares about preserving this kind of history, maybe consider subscribing so you don't miss these stories when they come out. Anyway, back to Sater. Terry Sater grew up in a small town in Ohio, which was pretty typical for a lot of the young men who ended up serving in Vietnam. He was born in the late 1940s, part of that generation that came of age right as America was escalating its involvement in Southeast Asia. Sater wasn't necessarily looking to be a hero or make some big political statement. Like a lot of guys his age, he got drafted, and when Uncle Sam called, you answered. That's just how it was back then. The draft wasn't something you could easily dodge if you were a working-class kid from Ohio without connections or money to get deferments. So Terry Sater found himself going through basic training, learning how to be a soldier, and then shipping out to a country most Americans couldn't have found on a map just a few years earlier. The 25th Infantry Division, which Sater served with, had a long and proud history stretching back to World War II. They were known as Tropic Lightning, and they'd fought in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War before being reactivated for Vietnam. By the time Terry Sater arrived in country, the 25th was operating in some of the most contested areas of South Vietnam, including the Cu Chi district, which was famous, or maybe infamous is a better word, for its tunnel systems. The Viet Cong had built an incredible network of underground passages that let them move troops, store supplies, and launch attacks seemingly out of nowhere. American soldiers would secure an area, think it was clear, and then suddenly take fire from enemies who seemed to materialize from the ground itself. It was a terrifying way to fight a war. Terry Sater's experience in Vietnam wasn't unique in the sense that a lot of infantrymen went through similar horrors. But every man's war is his own, you know what I mean? The details change, the specific moments of terror are different, but the fear, the confusion, the exhaustion, those things were universal. Sater has spoken about what it was like to be constantly on edge, never knowing when the next ambush would come, never feeling safe, even in supposedly secure areas. The enemy could be anywhere. That farmer you passed on the road, he might be Viet Cong. That kid selling soda, he might be carrying a grenade. It created a kind of paranoia that ate at men's minds. One of the things that made Vietnam so difficult for American soldiers was the nature of the conflict itself. This wasn't like World War II, where you had clear front lines and you could measure progress by territory gained. In Vietnam, the enemy melted into the population, used guerrilla tactics, and turned every patrol into a potential death trap. Terry Sater and his fellow soldiers would go out on operations, push through jungle and rice paddies, engage an enemy that would often disappear before any decisive battle could be fought, and then do it all over again the next day. The frustration was immense. You might take casualties clearing a village, and a week later the Viet Cong would be right back in the same spot. Sater's unit saw action in multiple operations during his tour. The 25th Infantry Division was involved in numerous campaigns throughout their time in Vietnam, from Operation Junction City in 1967 to various smaller actions in the years that followed. The division operated in 3rd Corps, the military region that included Saigon and its surrounding provinces. This was critical territory, and the fighting there was often intense. Terry Sater found himself in firefights where the world narrowed down to survival, where everything you'd learned in training either kicked in or it didn't, and where seconds felt like hours. One engagement in particular stands out in Sater's memory, and it's the one that led to that moment I mentioned at the beginning, the one where he made his deal with God. Terry Sater's unit was moving through an area when they walked into an ambush. The Viet Cong had set up killing zones with overlapping fields of fire, and Sater's patrol was caught right in the middle of it. Bullets were everywhere. Men were going down. The noise was overwhelming, that constant crack of AK-47 fire mixed with the heavier thump of machine guns and the shouts of wounded men calling for medics. In situations like that, there's no real time to think. You react based on instinct and training, or you die. Terry Sater hit the ground and tried to find cover, but in a rice paddy there isn't much cover to find. You've got these low dikes, maybe a foot or two of packed earth, and that's about it. The water and mud sucked at you, making every movement exhausting. Sater remembers the rounds snapping past, so close you could feel the air displacement. He remembers seeing other soldiers get hit, watching bodies jerk and fall. And in that moment, when death seemed absolutely certain, when there was no logical reason to think he'd survive the next few seconds, Terry Sater talked to God. The prayer, if you can even call it that, was pretty simple. Sater said something to the effect of, "If you're going to kill me, just kill me. Don't let me lie here suffering. Don't let me bleed out slow in this mud. If this is the end, make it quick." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't theological. It was just raw human honesty from a young man who thought he was about to die. And you know, I think there's something powerful about that kind of prayer. You'd think relief would be the primary emotion, and maybe it is in the immediate moment. But then comes the guilt. Why did I make it when those other guys didn't? What makes me special? And the truth is, nothing makes you special. It's random. That bullet that missed you by an inch could just as easily have hit you center mass. Terry Sater has talked about struggling with survivor's guilt, which is incredibly common among combat veterans. You carry the weight of the men who didn't come home, and that weight doesn't really get lighter with time. If you're still with me and this story is resonating with you, I just want to say thanks for listening. Stories like Terry Sater's deserve to be remembered, honestly they do. And if you're finding value in hearing these accounts, maybe hit that subscribe button so we can keep putting these veteran voices out there. This kind of history shouldn't get lost. All right, continuing on with Sater's experience. Terry Sater's tour in Vietnam wasn't defined by just one ambush, of course. That's the thing about serving in a combat zone for a year or more. The days blend together, punctuated by moments of absolute terror that burn themselves into your memory forever. In between the firefights, there was the grinding daily existence, the heat, the humidity, the insects, the diseases. Vietnam was hard on American soldiers in ways that went beyond just combat. Malaria was a constant threat. So was dysentery. Skin infections from the constant wet conditions plagued the troops. Jungle rot, they called it. Your feet would literally start to decay if you couldn't keep them dry, and you never could keep them dry. Terry Sater and the men of the 25th Infantry Division dealt with all of this, while also dealing with the psychological strain of the war itself. One thing that a lot of people don't fully appreciate is how young most of these soldiers were. The average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was around 19. 19 years old. These were kids, really. They'd been in high school just a year or two before, worrying about football games and prom dates. And now they were killing people and watching their friends die in a jungle on the other side of the world. Terry Sater was young, like most of them, barely out of his teens when he found himself in the thick of it. The maturity that combat forces on you is a cruel thing. You grow up fast, or you don't grow up at all. Sater has reflected on how Vietnam changed him in fundamental ways. The person who came back wasn't the same person who left. That's true for almost every combat veteran, but in Vietnam it was particularly stark because of the reception soldiers received when they returned home. Unlike the World War II veterans who came back to parades and gratitude, Vietnam vets often returned to hostility or, maybe worse, indifference. People didn't want to hear about what they'd been through. Some were called names, accused of being baby killers, spat on by protesters. Others just found that nobody wanted to talk about it, like the whole war was something shameful that should be forgotten. Terry Sater, like many veterans of his generation, had to navigate this difficult homecoming while also processing the trauma of what he'd experienced. The term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't even official terminology until 1980. Before that, it was called shell shock or combat fatigue. And many veterans were left to deal with their symptoms without any real understanding of what was happening to them. Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, difficulty connecting with people who hadn't been through what you'd been through. These weren't recognized as symptoms of a diagnosable condition that could be treated. You were just supposed to man up and get over it, which of course is not how trauma works at all. Terry Sater's journey after Vietnam is in some ways even more remarkable than his service itself. The fact that he survived combat was one thing, but surviving the aftermath, building a life, finding meaning after everything he'd seen and done, that's its own kind of battle. And Sater fought it like he fought the enemy in those rice paddies, with determination and grit. He didn't let Vietnam define him in a negative way, though it certainly marked him forever. Instead, Sater eventually found ways to share his experience, to help other veterans, and to make sure the stories of those who served weren't forgotten. One of the things that Terry Sater has been clear about is the importance of faith in his life after Vietnam. Remember that prayer in the rice paddy? The one where he basically told God to just get it over with if he was going to die? That moment of raw honesty with the Almighty didn't end when the ambush ended. For Sater, that experience became a touchstone, a reminder of how close he'd come to death, and a reason to think seriously about what life meant. Not every veteran finds faith after combat. Some lose whatever faith they had before. But for Terry Sater, the experience seemed to deepen his spiritual life in ways that helped him cope with everything that came after. The 25th Infantry Division that Sater served with continued operations in Vietnam until 1971, when it was withdrawn as part of the broader American drawdown. By that point, the division had suffered thousands of casualties and had earned numerous awards for valor. The men who served with Tropic Lightning, including Terry Sater, were part of a legacy that stretched back to the Pacific Island campaigns of World War II and would extend forward into future conflicts. But for the individual soldier, that legacy is often less important than the personal memories, the faces of friends lost, the sounds and smells that trigger flashbacks decades later. Sater has spoken about the bond between combat veterans, that understanding that only people who have been there can really have. It's something civilian life doesn't offer. You can have good friends, loving family, but there's a part of the combat veteran's experience that remains inaccessible to those who haven't shared it. This can be isolating, and it's one reason why veteran support groups and organizations are so important. When Terry Sater connects with other Vietnam veterans, there's an instant recognition, a shared vocabulary of experience that doesn't need to be explained. The wounds that veterans carry aren't always visible, and Terry Sater's story illustrates this well. You might pass him on the street and never guess what he'd been through. The scars from Vietnam aren't necessarily the kind you can see. They're the kind that wake you up at 3 in the morning, that make you flinch at a car backfiring, that create distance between you and loved ones who can't understand why you're withdrawn or irritable. These invisible wounds are every bit as real as a bullet hole, and they often last longer. Medical technology has gotten better at saving lives in combat, which is a good thing. But it also means more veterans come home carrying trauma that would have killed them in earlier wars. Sater's generation was caught in the transition, with Vietnam producing huge numbers of psychological casualties that the country wasn't prepared to address. The years after Vietnam saw Terry Sater, like many veterans, trying to build a normal life, work, family, the daily routines that define most people's existence. But the war was always there in the background, a shadow that could emerge without warning. A helicopter overhead could trigger it, the smell of diesel fuel, a humid summer day that felt too much like the jungle. These triggers could pull a veteran back to Vietnam in an instant, reliving moments that happened decades ago as if they were happening right now. That's the nature of traumatic memory. It doesn't fade like regular memory does. It stays vivid, stays present, ready to ambush you just like the enemy did in those rice paddies. Terry Sater's willingness to talk about his experiences is itself a form of courage. For many years, Vietnam veterans didn't talk about what they'd been through. The culture didn't encourage it, and their own pain made it difficult. But silence can be its own kind of poison. When you don't process trauma, when you don't share it, it festers. The movement toward veterans speaking out, sharing their stories, has been healing for many. It's also been educational for the rest of us, helping civilians understand what soldiers actually experience and what they need when they come home. The specific battles and operations that Terry Sater participated in were part of the larger American strategy in Vietnam, which evolved over the years. When Sater served, the military was conducting search and destroy missions, trying to find and kill the enemy in the field. The theory was that America's superior firepower would grind down the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army until they couldn't continue fighting. But the enemy had their own strategy, and it was based on outlasting American will to continue the war. They were willing to take enormous casualties because they were fighting for their homeland. And they figured, correctly as it turned out, that eventually America would tire of the conflict and go home. The ordinary soldiers like Terry Sater were caught in the middle of these grand strategies, doing their jobs, trying to survive, while decisions were made far above their pay grade. What Sater and his fellow infantrymen experienced on the ground often didn't match what officials in Washington were saying about the war's progress. The famous credibility gap between government statements and reality was something these soldiers saw firsthand. They knew they weren't winning hearts and minds in villages they had to destroy. They knew the body counts that made it into press releases didn't tell the real story. But their job wasn't to make policy. Their job was to follow orders, complete their missions, and keep each other alive. Terry Sater did his job. He did what his country asked of him, even when that mission was confused and the outcome was uncertain. The 25th Infantry Division operated in areas that included the Iron Triangle, a notorious Viet Cong stronghold northwest of Saigon. This area was honeycomb with tunnels, and operations there were particularly dangerous. American forces would clear areas, only to find the enemy reoccupying them soon after. The frustration of this kind of warfare wore on soldiers, making them question what they were accomplishing. But Sater and men like him kept going out, kept patrolling, kept fighting. That's what soldiers do. You might disagree with the war, you might think the whole thing is pointless, but you don't let down the man next to you. The small unit loyalty that develops in combat is incredibly strong, and it's often what keeps soldiers going when larger motivations fail. You're not fighting for democracy or against communism. You're fighting so your buddy makes it home. Terry Sater understood this kind of loyalty deeply. The men he served with became brothers in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Shared danger creates bonds that ordinary life can't replicate. Sater has spoken about the men he served with, remembering their faces, their personalities, their quirks. Some of those men didn't make it home, and Sater carries their memory with him. This is another burden that combat veterans bear, the responsibility to remember those who fell. It's a sacred obligation in a way, honoring the dead by keeping their stories alive. Terry Sater's story is part of a larger tapestry of Vietnam veteran experiences, each one unique but sharing common threads. The fear, the courage, the trauma, the resilience. These elements appear again and again when you listen to veterans talk about their time in country. And that's why it matters to preserve these accounts, to record them before the men and women who lived through them are gone. We're losing World War II veterans at a rapid pace now, and the Vietnam generation is aging too. Every veteran who passes takes their stories with them, unless someone takes the time to listen and record. This is living history, and once it's gone, it's gone. The official records can tell you about operations and casualty figures, but they can't tell you what it felt like to crouch in a rice paddy, making peace with God because you thought you were about to die. Only the veterans themselves can tell you that. As we get close to wrapping up Terry Sater's story, I want to pause and say something. If you've stuck with this whole thing, first of all, thank you. These stories take time to tell, and the fact that you're taking time to listen means something. If you want to hear more accounts like this, subscribing really does help get these veteran voices out to more people. And sharing these videos with others who might appreciate them, that helps too. These stories deserve to be remembered, and every person who listens and shares is helping to preserve this history. Okay, so bringing Terry Sater's story to a close. What do you do with an experience like the one Sater had in Vietnam? How do you integrate something like that into a normal life? There's no easy answer. Some veterans manage better than others, and the reasons why are complicated. Support systems help. Family and friends who are patient and understanding. Access to mental health care that actually works. A sense of purpose and meaning in civilian life. Faith, for those who have it. All of these things can make a difference. Terry Sater has managed to build a life after Vietnam, which is itself a victory. He didn't let the war destroy him, though it certainly left its marks. Sater's faith, which crystallized in that desperate moment in the rice paddy, has apparently been a source of strength for him in the decades since. When you've looked death in the face and said to God, "If you're going to kill me, just kill me," and then you don't die. That experience changes you. It gives you perspective that most people don't have. The The petty concerns of daily life seem less important when you've survived what Sater survived. Terry Sater represents something important about the Vietnam veteran experience. These weren't men who sought glory or wanted war. Most of them, like Sater, were drafted or enlisted out of a sense of duty, not bloodlust. They went where their country sent them, did what they were told to do, and paid a price that kept on being paid long after they came home. The wounds of Vietnam didn't heal cleanly for most veterans. The country itself was wounded by the war, divided in ways that we're still dealing with today. But the men who served, men like Terry Sater, they did their part. They answered the call, faced the enemy, and endured things that would break many people. The prayer that Sater made in that rice paddy, the one where he accepted the possibility of death while asking only that it be quick, that prayer says so much about what combat does to a person. It strips away pretense. It eliminates everything that isn't essential. In that moment, Terry Sater wasn't thinking about politics or strategy or anything beyond the immediate reality of his situation. He was a young man who thought he was about to die, and he was trying to make peace with that. That he survived, that he went on to live a full life, that he's been willing to share his story so others can learn from it, all of that matters. Terry Sater's experience in Vietnam was horrific in many ways. The ambushes, the firefights, the loss of friends, the constant fear, these aren't things anyone should have to go through. But Sater went through them, and he came out the other side. Not unchanged. Nobody comes out of combat unchanged, but intact in the ways that count. He maintained his humanity. He kept his faith. He built a life. And he's been willing to revisit that painful time in his past so that others can understand what the war was really like for the men who fought it. That's a gift, honestly. It's not easy to talk about trauma. Every time Sater tells his story, he's reliving it to some degree. But by telling it, he's helping to ensure that the Vietnam War isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a living memory, carried by men and women who were there. And we're running out of time to hear from those who served. The youngest Vietnam veterans are in their late 60s now. Many are in their 70s and 80s. We've already lost too many, and we'll lose more every year. So when a veteran like Terry Sater is willing to share, we should listen. We should honor that courage, the courage to speak about things that hurt to remember. We should make sure these stories get passed on so that future generations understand what was asked of these men and what they gave. Terry Sater went to Vietnam as a young man, barely out of his teens. He faced combat, made peace with death in a rice paddy, survived against the odds, and came home to a country that wasn't sure what to do with him. He dealt with the aftermath, the invisible wounds that combat leaves, the memories that don't fade. And through it all, Terry Sater kept going. That's the story, really. Not just the drama of combat, but the quiet persistence of living afterward. The courage to build a life when part of you is still in that rice paddy. The strength to talk about it when silence would be easier. The faith to believe that survival meant something, that there was a reason he made it out when others didn't. Terry Sater's story is one of millions of Vietnam stories, and each one matters. Each veteran carried their own war home with them, fought their own battles in the years that followed, tried to make sense of something that often doesn't make sense. We owe these men and women our respect, our attention, and our gratitude. Not because all of them were perfect, or because the war itself was right, but because they answered when they were called and gave everything they had. Harry Sater gave everything he had in those rice paddies and jungles of Vietnam, and then he came home and gave more. In the years of recovery, in his willingness to speak, in his effort to help others understand. That's the measure of a man, not just how he acts when the bullets are flying, but how he lives in all the years after. Terry Sater measured up. This was the story of Terry Sater, a Vietnam veteran who made a deal with God in a rice paddy and lived to tell about it. Thanks for listening.